Evil doesn't always announce itself with screams or manifestos. Sometimes it grows in the space between words in the moment when someone sees something wrong and decides that speaking up costs too much. This is the story of how silence becomes complicity, how ordinary people become accomplices, and how the absence of a voice can be just as destructive as the presence of cruelty. On a spring morning in 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. The initial reports claimed that 38 witnesses heard her cries for help over the course of half an hour. According to those early accounts, neighbors turned on their lights, opened their windows, and watched. But not one of them called the police until it was too late. The story became a symbol of urban apathy, a cautionary tale about bystander effect that psychologists would study for decades. What happened that night was later found to be more complicated than the newspapers reported. The number of witnesses was exaggerated. Some did call the police. The timeline was condensed, but the question the case raised never went away. It echoed through lecture halls and dinner table conversations in the dark corners of our collective conscience. Why do people who consider themselves good, moral, and decent choose to do nothing when they witness harm? And more disturbingly, when does that silence stop being passive and start becoming an active form of participation in the very evil they claim to oppose? We tend to think of evil as something performed by monsters, by individuals, so fundamentally broken or malicious that they exist outside the category of normal human beings. It's a comfortable fiction. It allows us to maintain a clear boundary between us and them, between the people who would never do such things and the people who would. But history tells a different story. History tells us that most of the worst atrocities committed by human beings were not carried out by psychopaths acting alone. They were enabled, facilitated, and allowed to flourish by ordinary people who made a simple calculation. The cost of speaking up was higher than the cost of staying quiet. This is not a story about dramatically evil acts. This is a story about the silence that makes those acts possible. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment that would become one of the most famous and controversial studies in the history of social science. Participants were told they were helping with research on learning and memory. They were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person every time that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks started at 15 volts and increased in 15-volt increments up to 450 volts, labeled on the machine as potentially lethal. The person receiving the shocks was actually an actor who wasn't being harmed at all, but the participants didn't know that. They heard screams. They heard pleading. They heard the actor mention a heart condition. And yet, when the authority figure in the white lab coat calmly told them to continue, 65% of participants administered shocks all the way to the maximum voltage. These are not cruel people. They were not sadists. They were ordinary men and women from New Haven, Connecticut, who afterward expressed deep distress about what they had done. But in the moment, they obeyed. What Milgram discovered was not that people enjoy harming others. It was that people will harm others when the situation is structured in a way that makes disobedience feel more dangerous than obedience. When someone in a position of authority normalizes the harm, when the responsibility feels diffused, when speaking up requires you to break the social script, silence becomes the path of least resistance. But there's another layer to this. Milgram's study focused on obedience to authority. What about situations where there is no direct order, no white lab coat, no experimenters standing over your shoulder? What about the moments when you simply witness something wrong and have to decide whether to speak or stay silent? This is where the bystander effect enters the frame, and this is where things become even more unsettling. The bystander effect describes a phenomenon where individuals are less likely to help a victim when other people are present. The larger the group, the less responsibility any single person feels. This isn't because people become less empathetic in groups. It's because the presence of others creates a diffusion of responsibility. If everyone is witnessing the same event, then surely someone else will do something. Surely it's not my job. Surely I'm misreading the situation. This psychological mechanism is so powerful that it can override our moral instincts entirely. Biblatain and John Darley conducted a series of experiments in the late 1960s to understand this effect more deeply. In one study, participants were placed in a room that slowly began to fill with smoke. When participants were alone, 75% of them reported the smoke within 2 minutes. But when participants were placed in the room with two actors who had been instructed to remain calm and ignore the smoke, only 10% reported it. The presence of passive others didn't just delay action. It nearly eliminated it. People sat in a room filling with smoke, coughing, waving their hands in front of their faces. But they stayed silent because everyone else was silent. The social cues around them communicated that this was not an emergency, that speaking up would make them look foolish or paranoid. So they adjusted their perception of reality to match the group. They convinced themselves that everything was fine. This is the mechanism that allows evil to thrive in plain sight. When a culture, an organization, or a community establishes silence as the norm, individuals within that system begin to police themselves. They don't need to be explicitly told to stay quiet. They see that others are staying quiet, and they infer that silence is the appropriate response. Over time, this creates an environment where abuse, corruption, exploitation, and cruelty can continue unchecked. Because everyone assumes that if it were truly wrong, someone would have said something by now. The silence becomes evidence that nothing is wrong. It's a self-reinforcing loop, and it operates below the level of conscious thought. Consider the Catholic Church abuse scandal, a case that unfolded over decades and involved thousands of victims. The abuse itself was committed by individual priests, but the systemic cover-up required the participation of bishops, cardinals, administrators, and entire diocesan structures. Documents revealed that church officials knew about the abuse, moved offending priests to new parishes, and prioritized the institution's reputation over the safety of children. But beyond the officials who actively concealed the crimes, there were countless others who suspected something, heard whispers, noticed warning signs, and chose not to push further. They didn't participate in the abuse directly. They didn't help cover it up in an official capacity, but their silence created the conditions under which the abuse could continue. Their silence signaled to the perpetrators that the community would not intervene. And so the harm continued, year after year, parish after parish, child after child. What makes this particularly chilling is that many of the people who stayed silent likely saw themselves as good, faithful, moral individuals. They were not motivated by malice. They were motivated by a desire to protect the institution they loved, to avoid conflict, to maintain their standing within the community. They told themselves that it wasn't their place to speak, that they didn't have all the facts, that surely someone higher up was handling it. These are the same rationalizations we all use when we encounter something that makes us uncomfortable. But acting on that discomfort would be inconvenient or risky. We tell ourselves it's not our business. We tell ourselves we might be wrong. We tell ourselves that speaking up would make things worse. And in the space created by those rationalizations, harm continues. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent much of his career studying moral disengagement, the cognitive processes that allow people to commit or enable harmful acts without experiencing guilt or distress. One of the key mechanisms he identified is diffusion. Of responsibility, the same dynamic at play in the bystander effect. When responsibility is shared across a group, no single person feels accountable. Another mechanism is euphemistic labeling, the use of sanitized language, to obscure the reality of what's happening. We see this constantly in institutional settings. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Civilian casualties become collateral damage. Layoffs become right-sizing. The language shifts, and suddenly the action feels less morally urgent. A third mechanism is displacement of responsibility, the belief that you're just following orders. Just doing your job, just one small cog in a much larger machine. These mechanisms don't require conscious cynicism. They're automatic, they're pervasive, and they allow ordinary people to participate in systems of harm while maintaining a coherent sense of themselves as good people. Now consider how these dynamics scale. In Nazi Germany, the genocide of 6 million Jews required the active participation of hundreds of thousands of people and the passive complicity of millions more. The trains had to run on time. The bureaucracy had to process the paperwork. The neighbors had to ignore the disappearances. The soldiers had to follow orders. The citizens had to accept the propaganda, or at least choose not to. Question it too loudly. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, coined a phrase, the banality of evil, to describe how ordinary, unremarkable individuals could participate in monstrous acts. Eichmann was not a raving fanatic. He was a bureaucrat who saw himself as a dutiful employee. He managed logistics. He organized schedules. He didn't personally kill anyone. And he seemed genuinely unable to grasp the moral weight of what he had facilitated. He had outsourced his conscience to the system. He had replaced moral reasoning with procedural compliance, and in doing so, he became an instrument of genocide. But Arendt's insight goes deeper than Eichmann himself. It extends to the millions of German citizens who were not members of the Nazi Party, who did not work in the camps, who may have even privately disapproved of what was happening. Their silence mattered. Their willingness to continue with daily life, to prioritize their own safety and comfort, to assume that someone else would take responsibility for stopping it. That silence was not neutral. It was a choice, and that choice had consequences. When we think about complicity, we often focus on the people who actively helped. But complicity also includes the people who saw and said nothing, who knew and did nothing, who prioritized. This is uncomfortable to confront because it implicates all of us. We live in a world filled with injustices, abuses, and preventable suffering. We encounter these things regularly. We see them in our workplaces, our schools, our communities, our news feeds. And most of the time, we make the same calculation that people have always made. We weigh the cost of speaking up against the cost of staying silent, and we choose silence. We tell ourselves we don't have enough information. We tell ourselves it's not our responsibility. We tell ourselves that one person can't make a difference, and those justifications feel reasonable. In the moment, they allow us to move through our day without the weight of moral responsibility crushing us, but they also allow harm to continue. The sociologist Irving Goffman wrote extensively about how we manage our public identities, how we perform versions of ourselves that align with social expectations. One of his key insights was that people will go to great lengths to avoid breaking the social frame, to avoid causing a scene, to avoid making others uncomfortable. This is why someone might stay silent during a meeting, even when they notice a colleague being unfairly attacked. This is why someone might laugh along with a racist joke, even though they find it offensive. This is why someone might walk past a person in distress rather than stop and ask if they need help. Breaking the frame, disrupting the flow of social interaction requires a kind of courage that most of us don't have most of the time. And so, we stay silent. We nod along. We keep walking. And the cost of that silence is borne by someone else. There's a term in organizational psychology called willful blindness, the deliberate choice to ignore information that would require you to act. It's not that you don't see the problem. It's that you choose not to see it fully, not to engage with it, not to allow it to impose moral demands on you. This happens constantly in corporate settings. Executives who don't ask too many questions about where their supply chain sources labor. Managers who don't investigate complaints because investigating would create problems. Employees who notice financial irregularities but decide it's not their job to report them. The blindness is willful because on some level they know. They just choose not to know enough to feel responsible. This is silence as strategy. This is silence as self-protection. And it works, at least for the individual choosing it, until the whole system collapses. Or until someone finally breaks the silence and forces everyone to confront what they've been ignoring. What's particularly insidious about this dynamic is that it compounds over time. The longer a harmful situation continues without anyone speaking up, the harder it becomes for any individual to break the silence. If this has been happening for months or years and no one has said anything, then speaking up now means implicitly accusing everyone who stayed silent before you of complicity. It means disrupting established patterns. It means risking retaliation not just from the person causing harm, but from the entire social structure that has adapted to accommodate that harm. This is why whistleblowers are so often punished, ostracized, and discredited. They're not just exposing the wrongdoing. They're exposing the complicity of everyone who knew and did nothing. They're holding up a mirror to the collective silence, and people hate them for it. The psychologist Catherine Sanderson has studied moral courage extensively, trying to understand what differentiates the people who speak up from the people who stay silent. Her research suggests that it's not a matter of personality type or inherent bravery. It's a matter of practice, of having frameworks for action, of being in environments that support, rather than punish dissent. People who speak up tend to have a strong internal locus of control, meaning they believe their actions can make a difference. They tend to have support systems that reinforce their values. They tend to have had previous experiences where speaking up led to positive outcomes, or at least didn't lead to catastrophic consequences. This suggests that silence is not inevitable. It's learned. And if it's learned, it can be unlearned. But unlearning silence requires confronting a deeply uncomfortable truth. It requires admitting that staying silent is a choice, and that choice has moral weight. We live in a culture that often treats silence as neutral, as the absence of action rather than an action itself. But silence is never neutral. Silence in the face of harm is a form of participation. It signals to those causing harm that they can continue. It signals to those being harmed that no one will help them. It shapes the social environment in ways that make future harm more likely. When we choose silence, we are choosing a side, whether we acknowledge it or not. The philosopher Edmund Burke is often quoted as saying, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." The phrasing is almost certainly apocryphal, but the sentiment captures something essential. Evil doesn't require a majority of active participants. It just requires a majority of passive observers. It requires enough people to decide that the risk of speaking up outweighs the moral imperative to act. And that calculation happens millions of times a day in small moments and large ones, in ways that seem inconsequential until you zoom out and see the pattern. Think about the hashtag #MeToo movement which exploded in 2017 when women began publicly sharing their experiences of sexual harassment and assault. The stories that emerged were not new. Many of them have been whispered about for years, sometimes decades. People in the industry knew, colleagues knew, assistants knew, but they stayed silent because the man in question was powerful, because speaking up could end a career, because they told themselves it wasn't their place. The silence protected the perpetrators and isolated the victims. And then someone spoke, and then someone else spoke, and the dam broke. The silence that had seemed so solid, so inevitable, turned out to be fragile. It only took a few people willing to accept the cost of speaking to shatter it. But think about all the harm that occurred during the years, when everyone knew and no one said anything. Think about all the people who could have stopped it earlier and chose not to. This is the weight of silence. It's not neutral. It's not passive. It's a decision to prioritize your own comfort, your own safety, your own social standing over the well-being of others. And that decision has consequences that ripple outward in ways we don't always see. The person who stays silent during a meeting when a colleague makes a racist comment is signaling to everyone in the room that such comments are acceptable. The person who ignores signs of abuse in a neighbor's home is creating an environment where the abuser feels safe to continue. The person who knows their company is engaging in fraud but doesn't report it is enabling that fraud to harm more people. These are not hypothetical examples. These are the everyday moments where silence becomes complicity. So what changes this? What breaks the cycle? The research suggests that it starts with individuals who are willing to bear the social cost of speaking up, but it can't end there. Individual courage is necessary, but not sufficient. What's needed is a cultural shift that treats silence in the face of wrongdoing not as the safe default, but as a moral failure. We need institutions that protect rather than punish people who speak up. We need social norms that celebrate moral courage rather than ostracize it. We need to teach people from a young age that there's no such thing as neutral silence, that witnessing harm creates a responsibility to act. This doesn't mean everyone has to become a full-time activist. It means that when you see something wrong, you acknowledge it rather than look away. It means that when someone is being harmed, you don't calculate the personal cost of helping before you help. It means that you refuse to let the comfort of silence outweigh the moral urgency of action. The uncomfortable truth is that most of us, in the right circumstances, would choose silence. We want to believe we'd be the person who stands up, who speaks out, who refuses to go along. But the evidence suggests otherwise. We are all vulnerable to the same psychological mechanisms that have enabled atrocities throughout history. We all experience the same social pressures, the same fear of conflict, the same desire to belong. The question is not whether we feel those pressures. The question is what we do despite them. Silence is not the absence of an action. It is an action in itself. A vote cast in favor of the status quo. A permission slip handed to those who cause harm. Every time you see something wrong and choose to say nothing, you're teaching the world that this particular wrong is tolerable. You're telling the person being harmed that they are not worth the risk. You're telling yourself that your comfort matters more than their suffering. And the most disturbing part is that you will find ways to justify it, to explain it, to convince yourself that you had no choice. But you did. You always do. The question that should haunt us is not whether we would have spoken up during history's darkest moments. The question is whether we are speaking up now, in small moments and the large ones, in the moments when it costs us something to do so, because evil does not need your support. It only needs your silence. If this script unsettled you, sit with that discomfort. Don't let it pass. Think about the moments in your own life when you chose silence. Think about what it would take to choose differently next time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a time when you spoke up or wish you had. Subscribe for more explorations into the darker corners of human psychology. And remember, the next time you witness something wrong, the world is watching to see if you'll be the one who finally breaks the silence.